Welcome to Blood and Botany. Today we often associate tulips with postcard-perfect images of the Dutch countryside. Thousands of tulips in every color imaginable planted in neat rows. But this wasn't always the case. In fact, tulips aren't even Dutch. The word tulip comes from the Persian word for turban. This is because they are native to the steppes and mountainous areas with temperate climates in the Near East and Central Asia. They had likely been cultivated in Persia since the 10th century. In the Ottoman Empire, they were a symbol of wealth, and when a 17th century Dutch trader spotted tulips while abroad, he had a business idea. So he took these exotic bulbs back to his home in the Dutch Republic. At the time, what is now the Netherlands, newly liberated from Spain, was at the height of its golden age. They were also now a global powerhouse, dominating international trade, finance, and art. Amsterdam was the financial capital of Europe, home to the world's first stock exchange, and the Dutch East India Company, the first publicly traded company. With money on the rise, so was the population. And in need of space, they began expanding their territory into the northern lowland using hydraulic dikes to reclaim the salt marsh coast. And wealth continued flowing into the country, creating a burgeoning middle class with disposable income and a taste for luxury goods. The world was in uncharted territory. It was the beginning of the global economy. When people have extra money, they like to spend it on non-essentials, so the craze began innocently enough. Tulips, with their vibrant colors and exotic origins, became a status symbol. For those looking to climb the social ladder, they offered a way to display wealth and sophistication. Tulips were also admired for their ability to brighten the otherwise dreary Dutch landscape. They seemed to thrive there, perennially popping up every spring from March to April and covering the hills with that much-needed color. Soon, the demand for rare and unique varieties led to skyrocketing prices. Certain bulbs, especially those showcasing striking patterns due to a virus called mosaic, became extraordinarily sought after. The intricate, multicolored patterns of these tulips made them a status symbol among the wealthy elite. Owning rare tulips became a way of signaling both your refined taste and your financial success. And since tulips have a dormancy period between blooms, people began seeing the bulbs themselves as more than just flowers. They were now investments. To put it into perspective, rare bulbs like the Semper Augustus could sell for as much as 10 times the annual income of a skilled craftsman. It's even said that one bulb was once traded for items like barrels of beer, a cartload of flour, and even a bed. And just like, say, the ferns to the Victorians, the obsession with tulips spilled over into the middle class. Merchants and even tradespeople were not immune. Seeing how prices were climbing, everyone wanted a piece of the action, and tulipmania wasn't just about the wealthy elites anymore. A speculative market emerged, with tulip bulbs being bought and sold like stocks. This coincided with the introduction of forward markets, a financial marketplace where participants agree to buy or sell an asset at a predetermined price for delivery on a future date, rather than on the spot. These markets were gaining traction as global trade networks expanded and economies became increasingly interconnected. So people traded tulip contracts, essentially the promise to purchase bulbs at a later date, but most never planned to actually take possession of the flowers. During this 2-year period, mostly from 1634 to 1636, they were flipping contracts just to make a quick profit. Sometimes a single unplanted bulb would change hands 5 or more times, and this usually all took place in taverns. In the meantime, others began mass cultivating tulips in the Dutch countryside, developing new tulip varieties through breeding and hybridization to catch a higher price. This was all fueled by the belief that prices would continue climbing indefinitely, and soon the market became oversupplied with tulip contracts. There were more sellers than buyers, and as you might have guessed, there was a major problem here, besides the problem of having more sellers than buyers. Tulips, at the end of the day, aren't practical assets. A tulip is just a flower. It doesn't generate income or produce resources. Another major problem? Tulips enter, like I said before, a dormant period after their spring blooming cycle, and that's where they rest and regenerate. But also during this time, the bulbs produce new bulbs called offsets around the parent bulb under the soil. Not only were there more sellers than buyers, but there was an oversupply of tulips because they kept regenerating. All of these factors were causing buyers to lose confidence, and in 1637, almost overnight, something happened. The speculative bubble burst, the demand for tulips plummeted, contracts became worthless, and those holding them were left with massive losses. The tulips, that were worth so much only recently, were suddenly worthless. So what happened? Economist Charles P. Kindleberger's basic structure of a speculative bubble can be applied to the Dutch tulipmania, dividing it into 5 distinct phases. 1. Displacement. The introduction of exotic tulips to the thriving Dutch market created a new and highly sought-after luxury good. Think the latest Hermes bag, sparking significant interest and profit opportunities. 2. The boom. Tulip prices began to rise exponentially as both enthusiasts and investors bought bulbs, not necessarily for planting, but for reselling at increasingly higher prices. 3. Euphoria. Speculative investments became widespread, and tulips were traded as a form of wealth, often detached from their actual intrinsic value, or their practical value. 4. Financial distress. Tulip prices reached a plateau, prompting some individuals to sell their bulbs to realize profits. This created anxiety among other investors, and allegedly, in February 1637, a tulip auction in Haarlem failed to attract buyers willing to pay previous high prices. And this sent a shockwave through the market, signaling that the peak had passed. Finally, 5. Revulsion. Panic set in as prices plummeted. Investors raced to sell their tulip holdings, leading to a collapse in the market and a cascade of losses. And to complicate matters more, there really isn't an agreed-upon answer for why speculative bubbles happen in the first place. When it comes to tulipmania, most of what we know comes from Scottish journalist Charles Mackay and his 1841 book Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. And most of his account was sourced from Johann Beckmann's 1797 book, A History of Inventions, Discoveries, and Origins. But neither of these are true contemporary accounts. And this narrative of tulipmania went largely unchallenged until fairly recently. In the 1980s, proponents of the efficient market hypothesis, which is a theory that asset prices fully reflect all available information, spoke out about tulipmania, saying Mackay's description was hyperbolic, and that the 17th century market for tulips was much smaller and less devastating. And some historians and economists even argue that tulipmania didn't constitute a true economic bubble. And in fact, many of the contemporary examples cited by Beckmann were satirical, similar to the 1640 painting by Jan Bruegel the Younger, which portrays monkeys in human clothes mimicking the actions of tulip traders. Instead, they suggest that the market for tulips was limited to a small group of wealthy traders and that the broader Dutch economy was largely unaffected. This debate remains unresolved, with no clear consensus on the scale or impact of tulipmania, just a lot of disagreement. And as you can imagine, many of these same economists were outraged when tulipmania became a popular reference during the dot-com bubble of 1995 to 2001. Also, apparently don't bring it up with crypto bros. But we do have historical documents to back up that there was some tulip-related impact on the Dutch economy at the time. It might not have caused an entire economic collapse, but many individuals did face financial ruin. This was partially fueled by the Dutch government's ruling that tulip contracts were akin to gambling, meaning there was no legal basis for enforcing them. Most of these agreements took place around copious amounts of alcohol and probably a stone's throw away from gambling, after all. It was brought to court several times, but at the end, most of the contracts were never honored. The collapse of the market led to a loss of trust in contracts and financial institutions. Even if there wasn't a speculative bubble, the cultural legacy of tulipmania and its ramifications does live on in the surviving art of this time period, specifically paintings from the era. When economic bubbles form and eventually burst, they can significantly influence spending habits. During a bubble, market participants with overvalued assets often spend more due to the wealth effect, where they feel wealthier than they actually are. However, when the bubble bursts and asset values plummet, those holding these overvalued assets understandably feel a loss of wealth, and this shift in perception leads to reduced discretionary spending, which can slow economic growth or worsen an economic downturn. The Dutch Golden Age would come to an end only a few decades later, in 1672, and largely due to costly wars, political instability, but also general economic decline. Could tulipmania have contributed to this? It's possible. And in the coming years, this would not be the Dutch Republic's only run-in with flora and fauna problems. Remember those hydraulic dikes in the Northern Territories I mentioned at the top of this episode? Well, they were made of wood, and about 100 years after tulips wreaked their havoc, a ship, possibly returning with trade goods from warmer waters, would arrive at a Dutch port carrying the naval shipworm, which was actually a mollusk with a massive appetite for wood. What ensued was an outbreak, which turned the only barrier separating Dutch civilization from the sea into Swiss cheese, eating away at the foundation of the lowlands. The barriers were eventually replaced with stone and other mollusk-resistant materials, but it's safe to say Mother Nature was really not on their side at this time. Unlike the wooden sea dikes, the tulip stayed, however, continuing to multiply under the region's sandy clay soils for hundreds of years. Today, the Netherlands is the world's leading producer and exporter of tulip bulbs, with millions being shipped worldwide annually. There are even some conspiracy theories I found online that this whole entire story was somehow made up by the Dutch government as a ploy to sell more tulip bulbs. And in the past few decades, it's true, we've seen many fads. The Beanie Baby craze, and now Labubus. And maybe when history repeats itself, sometimes it's botanical. Thanks for listening to Blood and Botany. Be sure to subscribe for more plant-related stories. Thanks, bye.